All right, guys, and here's our slide and lecture on sexual motivation. This fits in with this unit on motivation in general because as we just talked about with hunger, sexual motivation is very important in human lives. And for humanity in general, I mean, this is where we all come from. So this is a very important thing to talk about in terms of psychology and what causes this kind of motivation. And so you can see from my introduction slide here, I have a picture both for the men and the ladies, picture of Angelina Jolie, and I don't know who this dude is. He's an actor. I've seen him before, but it seemed like he'd be attractive to females. So, what causes sexual motivation? There are many reasons. We have to go back to our biopsychosocial approach to understand what causes sexual motivation. Here you're looking at pictures. Pictures cause sexual motivation, but they aren't by any means the only things that do that. So let's kind of move into this and talk about the sexual response cycle here. Right? Scientists have pinpointed 4 different phases of the sexual response cycle, which is essentially kind of how we go from being at a neutral state all the way through being excited sexually through orgasm and then coming back to that neutral state that we started in at the beginning. And so there's 4 different kind of stages here. And so let's look at them, all right? First, you have the excitement phase. This is when, going back to the picture of, Angelina Jolie and that hunky guy there, maybe something like that would get somebody excited. That's the first phase. It can also be somebody saying something to you that starts to excite you. And so that's the first phase when we start to get excited. With men, the result of this is achieving a hard-on. An erection is the proper scientific term. And for females, they actually secrete vaginal fluids when they are excited. And so you have those 2 different things in males and females. And thank God that, we're not like the bonobo. I don't know if anybody's familiar with what the bonobo is. It's basically very close to what a chimpanzee is, but they're a little different and they are very sexually active animals. I think the most sexually active animals out there, to tell you the truth. And so when females get excited, they don't just secrete some vaginal fluids, because that's not enough to let the males know that they're excited. No, their vagina literally grows to an insane size and turns this bright red, which contrasts very heavily with obviously the hairy body of like a bonobo, which is similar to a chimpanzee. And so good thing humans aren't like that. But so in humans, just went back. So in humans, for women, it's much less discreet. Much more discreet when they become sexually kind of, when that excitement phase starts. So then there's the plateau phase. Okay, the plateau phase is I don't know, I guess it's the time during sex when you're kind of at a plateau. You're excited, but you're not becoming necessarily more excited. And, again, this happens during sexual activity when you see this. And then the plateau phase eventually ends its plateau and reaches its climax at the orgasm stage, right? And this is when men ejaculate, and this is when women have an orgasm. And so and of course, a woman doesn't have an orgasm the same way a male does. So, but that's that phase. And now there's big differences between male and females in this stage, right? With males, after they ejaculate, usually there's this resolution phase or a refractory period, right? Where it's the time period where a male can't have another orgasm, and it follows immediately after having an orgasm. And so with females, it's much different, because after a female has an orgasm, first off, they can get an orgasm pretty quickly in many cases, and then they can also have them again right afterwards, and they have multiple orgasms within a short period of time, whereas with guys, it's not like that. So let's say 2 people are engaged in sexual activity. A female may have more than a couple orgasms during that activity, whereas a male might only have 1. And when it comes to a refractory period, usually the refractory period with females is shorter than for males. But even within males, that refractory period can be different. For some males, they may not be able to engage in sexual activity for another, I don't know, let's say 5 minutes. And then another male might be 20 minutes, an hour. It all depends on the male. People differ when it comes to things like this. And so that's our sexual response cycle. Now, when we talk about sex, we have to talk about hormones, because for a lot of people, this is what is mostly associated with sexual excitement, right, and sexual motivation. If a male has a lot of testosterone, he will be extremely sexually motivated. Believe it or not, that's not actually the case. When it comes to testosterone, which, by the way, is the male sexual hormone, if a person has a sufficient amount of hormones, then they should be okay, right, in terms of having sexual motivation and having sexual desire. If you increase a male's testosterone, or even take away some of a male's testosterone, in a small amount, it doesn't really affect their sexual motivation in any way whatsoever. However, it's in large amounts that you see much more of a difference. For instance, if you were to I'm trying to think of the good term here. We talk about this in world history. With men that have had their testicles removed at some point in their life. And now when you remove a man's testicles, you're essentially cutting them off from where all their testosterone is created. And so when you erase this from them, you do see a drop in their sexual motivation. Now, the younger you do this, the more drastic effect this actually has. But believe it or not, with modern science today, there are things like patches or pills or even injections, I think, but patches are the #1 way, which is basically a testosterone replacement method that can actually increase your sexual desires and activities. So for females, let's look at that. Now, we haven't talked about estrogen. Estrogen is the female sexual hormone. Now, the interesting thing is, if you increase estrogen in a woman or decrease it, it doesn't actually have any effect on their sexual activity. What does have an effect on their sexual motivation is testosterone. If you increase a woman's testosterone levels, even just a little bit, that can have a decent size effect on their sexual motivation. If you decrease it, the same thing. So for women that have gone through menopause, which is basically when they are finished having periods and they no longer produce eggs from their ovaries, a lot of women tend to lose because that's where their estrogen is released. It's during that ovulation period. And so when that's over around, let's say, the age 40 or the 50s, when women go through menopause, when this happens, they lose a lot of sexual desire during this time period. And it isn't just because of the estrogen, but it's also they have a drop in testosterone. And so in order for women to regain their sexual motivation and their sexual energy, they have to take testosterone, not estrogen. Testosterone is what will help rebuild that sexual motivation. So pretty interesting. So again, I'll say it one more time. Testosterone for both male and females is the key indicator of sexual motivation, but more so with women than men. And that's that. Okay, moving on. And with animals, it's totally different from humans. You inject testosterone or estrogen into animals, and it has a big effect on their sexual motivation. But humans are a little different in that case. But so moving on, we want to talk about a couple different things that arouse people, and external stimuli is certainly one of them. Now, eroticism can mean different things to different people. Now, this picture on the right-hand side could be very erotic to some people. Okay, for other people, it might not be a big deal. Now, the people to whom it's not a big deal are probably people that are that see images like this quite often. And we do in our culture, in our cultures, we tend to see images like this all the time, whether it's advertisements, TV, just in real life, walking down the street, wherever. So we see images like this quite often, and so it really, we're almost kind of numb to it at this point. It's not that big of a deal. But for people that don't see something like that often, they might find it pretty erotic. And so again, this is a very kind of how do I want to put it? It depends on the person. It's kind of a vague term, ambiguous term in some ways. Okay, but so then there's the porn side. We got to talk about pornography a little bit in this, because when it comes down to it, pornography is a very large industry, and many men watch pornography now. With the increase in internet speeds and the ubiquity of computers, in our world today, pornography has only grown. When I was a kid, you only had pornography on a videotape. Much harder to get, and there was also a stigma if somebody walked into a video store, into the porn section to rent a video. I mean, how embarrassing is that? You're renting a porn, and all of a sudden, I don't know, your boss walks in and sees you looking at porn, or maybe a friend, or anything. It could be very embarrassing. So porn wasn't as popular when I was a kid, but now with the computer, it is. And they say, here's kind of an interesting stat, and it's not an exact stat. I forget what the exact numbers are, but they say 80% of the paid for TV in hotels is pornography. And so that's a very, very important part of hotel groups, and when they set up a hotel, they make sure porn is available on their TV, because people usually rent it. And so, all right, so there's this. And so definitely external stimuli gets people excited by watching it. Usually with the porn, again, men become more excited watching porn than females on average. And then, this picture right here is probably something that females might find more erotic, and that might get them more sexually excited. Why? Because women tend to they're not into the hardcore sex scene that you see in pornography, but more into the kind of intimate scenes that you're seeing in this picture right here, where it seems like true love, and these people are very happy together, and they're about to have a passionate kiss, maybe. That's more appealing to women, studies have shown. And so that's the external stimuli. And now, what is that? Is porn good or bad? That's a debate that has gone on for a while. And for a long time, porn was illegal in some places. It still is illegal in many places. What is the effect of porn on people that watch it? Essentially, porn, like I said with this picture earlier, kind of numbs people. And so if somebody watches a lot of porn, what they'll tend to do is come to find their partner as maybe less attractive, less adventurous, and less sexually appealing than they did before. Because by watching porn, they're introduced to all these new kind of sexual behaviors that they may find interesting, and as a result, it affects how they view their own partner, whether it's a girlfriend, boyfriend, or wife or husband. So porn can have a pretty bad effect. And even furthermore, it can be bad in the sense that porn typically depicts women in submissive roles in which they're being somewhat abused, at least verbally, or just, sometimes physically in the case of some extreme kinds of porn. And things like that are bad, because then it drills into the mind of men watching it that, this is how women like to be treated, and this is how they should be treated. And so that can have a big effect on women. Okay, so then there's the imagined stimuli, and this comes down to the brain, guys. The brain is by far the most important sex organ that we have. If we aren't into sex, if we aren't, maybe intellectually, or I don't know, it depends on, I guess, your perception, but if your perception of your partner isn't strong and it isn't good, then you might not be sexually attracted to somebody. I know this is something that guys say a lot with like famous people. Let's say there's a guy, some actor, good-looking guy, married to this really good-looking female as well. And then later on, it comes out that the male cheated on this wife. And a lot of guys would say, oh my God, why would he cheat on her? She's beautiful. Oh my God, what more could you want? But see, the thing is, the brain is more important than those physical looks. First off, not only is it how our brain perceives the physical looks of a person, but it's also how our brain perceives the emotional aspect of another person and the intellectual aspect of another person, and whether or not we find that attractive. You can have a person that's physically, very good looking, but if their partner doesn't, perceive them as being maybe smart or interesting or funny or whatever, then that might erase any physical attraction there may be. And so the brain is by far the most important sex organ that we have. So how we think about somebody and how we think about sex in our own minds, whether it's through dreams or sexual fantasies, that also plays an important role in our sexual motivation. So here's our biopsychosocial analysis of sexual motivation. Here on the biological influences, you can see sexual maturity. This has to do with puberty. Below that is sexual hormones. We talked about testosterone in particular. And then there's sexual orientation, and that goes to homo and heterosexuality, which we'll get into right after this. Okay. And then the next thing that we're going to look at, if it'll move, there we go, is psychological influences. Exposure to stimulating conditions is important. Again, pornography, going back to that. And then there's the sexual fantasies, what you're thinking in your head and how you're thinking about them, and that makes a difference. Okay, and lastly, there's social cultural, which we didn't talk about too much, but societal values do make a difference. If you live in a society that is very open to sex, then you might have more sexual motivation than somebody that lives in a society where sex is repressed. I think of the famous book, The Scarlet Letter, that takes place back in my home state of Massachusetts back during the 1600s when Puritans, which is a very strict religious group, ruled that region. And essentially, women were not allowed to show any skin. Sex, you could not have sex until marriage. Even then, when you did have sex, usually it was for the purpose of procreating and making babies, not for pleasure. So times have changed since those Puritan days, but nevertheless, it shows that within a society that represses sex, your sexual motivation may be decreased. On the flip side, there are Polynesian cultures. I think Samoa is it? Or the Solomon Islands. Women are actually expected to have sex, and men are expected to have sex before they are married. That is something that their family expects of them. So that is a complete opposite of what those Puritan values are. And so then there's religious and personal values. Okay. What your religion says about sex is important. Your personal values, that's important. Your cultural expectations, going back to whether it's Puritan society in Massachusetts or Solomon Island society. And then there's the media. How does the media depict sex? And that will also influence you and how you do. So here we go. When it comes to, I don't want to spend too much time in this. So when it comes to this teen pregnancy, what are the main causes for teen pregnancy? Well, number one is ignorance, just not being educated about the science of sex and things like that, and the implications of having babies. That leads to certainly higher teen pregnancy. But that also includes here minimal communication about birth control. Right? If people aren't taught about birth control, then they're more likely to be pregnant or get pregnant. Guilt related to sexual activity. That's interesting. Sometimes if people that have guilt related to sexual activity, they're probably less likely to have babies. Alcohol use increases the chances of teen pregnancy because when people are drunk, their inhibitions are lowered, which means that they tend to do things that they normally wouldn't do. That includes having sex. And then there's mass media norms of unprotected promiscuity. All right, so our media basically promotes teenagers having sex, so that's going to increase teenage pregnancy to some extent. So. And here we go, sexually transmitted infections or diseases. Obviously, the number one way to prevent this is abstinence, which means no sex. So teen abstinence means no sex. Okay, so that's obviously the best way to do this. But more importantly, what we tend to see I'm looking at the first dash here is high intelligence. Usually students that have higher intelligence tend to have sex less, and as a result, definitely have less babies. I mean, that makes sense. But more importantly, if you have higher intelligence and you are having sex, you probably tend to use condoms and other preventative measures than if you have lower intelligence. So high intelligence in a teenager, or anybody for that matter, will really kind of make a difference there. Religious engagement, when it comes to abstinence, the more religious people are, the less sex they tend to have. And then father presence, this is especially important for females. If a father isn't present, which you tend to see if parents are divorced or separated, the father tends to live by themselves and the kids live with the mother. So if you don't have that father presence, females tend to have sex at a younger age and they don't have that guidance from a strong male presence in the household. And that can lead to STDs or STIs, as it says here, or a pregnancy. And then there's participation in service learning programs. Obviously, if you're involved in educational programs around people that are like-minded, then you'll probably have less sex. So, okay. Sexual orientation, actually, I'm going to stop here, guys. I'm going to talk about this at a later time in class. All right, bye-bye.